Hist 3710, Nazism, Stalinism, and the Rise of the Total State. We've made it to week 11, so we will have our summary and conclusions lecture. So, what was this all about then? That's our question for today. We spent the last 10 weeks comparing and contrasting Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union under Stalin. And we've also devoted much of our time to an attempt to place these two systems in a broader European context. So, one of our fundamental questions was, were they unique and unprecedented systems? That is, the systems of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union under Stalin. Were they unique and unprecedented? Or can we see precedents and parallels in other contemporary European democratic states? Now, as I mentioned back in the first week, we're not the first to pose these questions. So as early as the mid-1930s, some political commentators observed fundamental similarities between the Nazi and Soviet regimes. So they observed the single-party dictatorship, the fact that the dictator had a cult of personality, they observed the use of terror, and so on. But in the 30s and during World War II, such comparisons were rare. So Europe, during the Depression, was starkly divided politically, and the Nazi and Stalinist regimes were symbols of that division, right, between the far left and the far right. So how could they, in the 1930s, the thought was, how could they be more starkly different? And the contrasts were further reinforced by war. In the public consciousness during World War II, Hitler was the enemy and the Soviet Union under Stalin was the ally. But all that changed suddenly when the war was over and half of Europe was under Soviet occupation. When a further expansion of the Soviet Empire seemed likely in Greece, in the Middle East and Asia, then conversation shifted to the idea of a Soviet threat. The Soviet threat was very much in everybody's minds, and not least the possibility of another war loomed very large in the public and political imagination. So for 6 years between 39 and 45, a war had been fought to contain Nazi aggression. And now it seemed likely that a new war would have to be fought to contain Soviet aggression. In the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, the popular hatred of Hitler and the Nazis easily transferred to Stalin and the Soviet Union. So suddenly there was a great interest in the comparison of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in these two totalitarian states. Western governments funded a boom in studies of the Soviet Union and in comparisons of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So it was in this context that the so-called totalitarian model emerged. And the model was an ambitious project, a very serious comparative research, plotting point by point what were perceived to be the fundamental similarities between these regimes. These were, at least in Friedrich and Brzezinski, boiled down to 6 points. That is, the so-called 6-point syndrome of totalitarianism. Characteristics that, as the originators of the model pointed out, made the totalitarian systems unique and unprecedented. And these are: 1, an ideology; 2, a single party led by one man; 3, a terroristic police; 4, a monopoly of communications; 5, a monopoly of weapons; and 6, a centrally directed economy. So for the subsequent 2 decades, that is from the late 40s through the late 60s, the totalitarian model was almost universally accepted, approved, taken as a given. But since the end of the 1960s, a vast amount of research has been done both on the Soviet Union and on Nazi Germany, though very little of it has been explicitly comparative. Now, our object in this module was to explore this new research and to draw our own conclusions. Can we still accept the conclusions drawn by Friedrich and Brzezinski and other theorists of totalitarianism? Or another way of putting it, has the new research reinforced or undermined the totalitarian model? Do we still accept that these systems were unique and unprecedented? So what have we learned from the research on contemporary Europe, on Britain, on France, even America, and how does that material fit into or contradict the totalitarian model? So what we'll do then is we'll follow through these 6 points of the syndrome and consider these questions. Okay, so we'll consider the first issue then, that is an ideology. So we never explicitly addressed this issue, though to a considerable extent we touch on it in most of the lectures. So there were, as I have observed, very different ideological programs between the two states. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union began to build at a colossal pace an industrial infrastructure that was ultimately to form the basis of a socialist society, a workers' paradise. The Nazis set about to restore national greatness, by contrast, right? To build a greater Germany. And this involved bringing an end to the European order of the Versailles Treaty, incorporating the Germanic peoples on the borderlands as part of a larger program of creating living space. And it also involved racial purification, the creation of a pure Aryan race. Okay. We also need to think about this question of whether the Nazi regimes and Stalin regimes were revolutionary or conservative. We certainly touched on their revolutionary elements. But the research on ideology observes the contradictions and zigzags. That is to say, both were self-styled revolutionary ideologies, but both had powerful strains of traditional, conservative, even atavistic thought. And we then need to think about that ideology in a broader European context and ask whether the Nazi and Stalin revolutions were not part of a broader European concern for national revival. And those of you who took 3709, that is the breakdown of liberal democracy in Europe, will remember the disaffection with liberal democracy that characterized the turn of the century Europe. That is the pervasive sense of cultural and political decline, which was reinforced by the economic decline of the Great Depression. And what we highlighted in that lecture on the breakdown of liberal democracy was the attraction of both totalitarian regimes, fascist and communist, in the Europe of the 1930s. So this more recent literature on ideology, does it constitute a challenge to the totalitarian model? Well, Friedrich and Brzezinski merely observed that though Nazi and Soviet ideologies were very different, at opposite poles of the political spectrum, both regimes pursued policy programs mapped out in their respective ideological systems. But what we have observed was that recent research has questioned just how inflexible these ideological systems were. That is, they note the contradictions and the zigzags of policy. And we pointed out that the Nazi and Soviet ideologies were not alien to the rest of Europe, but on the contrary, had considerable resonance and attraction. Okay, so again, it's for you to decide whether you think the new evidence contradicts what Friedrich and Brzezinski has to say, whether it will lead you to conclude that the Nazi and Soviet systems are or are not unprecedented and unique. But let's move on to our second point. That is a single party led by one man. And again, we never directly addressed this issue of the structure of the political systems, though a considerable amount of research has been devoted to this theme in the last few decades. So as Friedrich and Brzezinski observed, there are striking similarities in the political structures. That is, particularly in that the Nazi and Soviet communist parties monopolized decision-making nationally and locally, while a state apparatus carried out the party's instructions. We have this distinction between leadership and administration, but under a single party. But again, in the last couple of decades, research has shown that these political systems were not as monolithic or even as coherent as Friedrich and Brzezinski thought. So various branches of the party structures, both in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, constantly fought amongst themselves and drew policy in contradictory directions. Further, Hitler and Stalin were not necessarily fully in control of the party apparatus, as Friedrich and Brzezinski assumed. So Hitler was generally withdrawn, that is, not interested in day-to-day policy making. And Stalin seems to have been constantly frustrated by his inability to get the party and the state structures to respond to his will, to central direction. Now, rather than to wade into the huge literature and involved debates on the political structures of the two states, we can look at the cults of Hitler and Stalin as a sort of proxy. And what we can see is that Friedrich and Brzezinski argued was that this absolute power of the leader was reinforced, among other things, by a cult of personality, by an aura of manipulated propaganda. But others have shown that these cults weren't always effective. In the case of Nazi Germany, the cult of the Führer was effective only as long as Hitler produced a steady flow of domestic and foreign policy successes. In the Soviet Union, the characterizations of Stalin and his leadership were frequently adjusted in response to popular opinion, even though these responses, and even then the responses could be quite negative. Okay? Now, as you revise for the exam, you may want to look at this issue in the context of the broader literature of the structure of the political systems in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and ask yourself, to what extent can the personalities of Hitler and Stalin be separated from the movements that they led? Was Nazism separable from Hitler the individual? Would it have been impossible without him? And you could pose the same question for that of Stalin and Soviet socialism. And do remember too that one can also set leader cults in the European context by asking whether peculiar historical circumstances predisposed the people of Germany and Russia to leader cults. And to that end, you can look at cults of Germany's leaders in the imperial period and cults of the Tsars in Russia, and then compare those to the attitudes to to the attitudes towards contemporary leaders in the rest of Europe. But there really isn't a particularly developed literature on the subject. But ask me if you want references to pursue the question. Okay. So getting on to the issues that we have discussed in some detail, the third characteristic was a terroristic police force. Now here we ask the question, did ordinary Germans and Soviet citizens live in fear of the political police? Well, certainly the proponents of the totalitarian model argue that they did. That terror was a quintessential method of totalitarian rule. That the total revolutionary change proposed by these regimes would necessarily produce opposition, and that their obsession with total unanimity predisposed them to build massive political police organizations. But then what of the subsequent research? Again, the totalitarian model has been subject to substantial challenges. The first of these have come from those who have studied popular opinion in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Here I'm referring to Peukert and Davis in particular, but there are many others beyond them. And these are studies that have been based largely, they're not entirely, on the materials collected by political police forces, by the Gestapo in Germany and the NKVD in the Soviet Union. And perhaps most strikingly, these studies have shown the high degree of popular support that these regimes enjoyed. Particularly, German and Soviet citizens credited their respective regimes for improvements in their living standards. That is, concretely, for the benefits that they personally derived from Nazi and Soviet policies. At the same time, they complained on the same level. They complained about shortages, about rising prices, about a variety of policies of which they disapproved. And these complaints were not characteristic of a population that lived in fear. Which is not to say that fear did not exist. So, for example, the members of former communist and socialist parties in Nazi Germany did and had every reason to live in constant fear of arrest. And of course, the Jews of Nazi Germany endured relentless and worsening persecution. In the Soviet Union, the so-called class enemies and former oppositionists, and during the Great Terror, the massive party officialdom lived in fear of the political police. But for the mass of the population, the work of the political police won a significant measure of popular approval. Now, the other challenge to the totalitarian model we discussed in the seminar, that is to say, studies of the process of denunciation, particularly in Nazi Germany, have shown that the apparatus of the political police was poorly staffed and depended on the voluntary participation of ordinary citizens to do their work. And again, this contradicts the image presented by Friedrich and Brzezinski of an all-powerful, all-pervasive state, anticipating and rooting out opposition and instilling fear in its citizenry. Can we see a broader context for terror? Broader European context? Was there such a thing as terror in democratic states? Well, not terror, no. Those of you who took the other module, HIST 3709, will remember that we asked a related question in the context of the Nazi occupation of France. That is, why did ordinary French men and women collaborate with the Nazis? And in what circumstances did they participate in the Nazi terror system? Okay? It's one way of approaching the question. Another way of approaching the question was to look at the McCarthy period in the United States as a form of terror. Though, of course, what you cannot compare between McCarthyism and, for example, the terror under Stalin is the number of victims. So the victims of McCarthyism in the United States might rank in their scores, whereas in the Soviet Union we're talking about millions. Now on to the fourth characteristic in Friedrich and Brzezinski of a totalitarian regime. We see a monopoly of communications. Now this fourth characteristic we discussed, as do Friedrich and Brzezinski, in terms of propaganda. Okay? Monopoly of communications seen in terms of propaganda. This is how the state employs this monopoly of communications to deliver a very focused message. So what were the mechanisms of propaganda and how effective were they? Well, we looked at this issue from several angles. So we looked at Nazi and Soviet culture, and we saw that both regimes were suspicious of their avant-garde movements. And for similar reasons, they imposed strict controls on cultural production and demanded that literature and art reflect the ideals of the regime. So Nazi art was anti-Semitic, it was nationalistic, it was obsessed with physical beauty and racial purity. Soviet art, by contrast, portrayed an idealized communist society. Workers on the shop floor, happy collective farm workers at the harvest, and so on. And it was calculated that by constantly bombarding the citizenry with positive images of the regime and the ubiquitous promotion of its ideals, that ordinary Germans and Soviets would internalize their implicit message. As we saw, too, the regimes worked particularly hard to win the support of youth. They were thinking about the new generation that would carry the revolution forward. But how effective was propaganda? Recent research would appear to indicate that it was not as effective as Friedrich and Brzezinski had assumed. Particularly in Germany, ordinary citizens had experienced the freedom and diversity of life in Weimar Germany, and they reacted against the more heavy-handed attempts of the Nazi regime to control popular attitudes. So, for example, the anti-exhibits of so-called degenerate art always drew significantly larger crowds than exhibits of official art. In the case of German youth, we discussed the emergence of groups such as the Edelweiss Pirates and Swing Youth as a response to the increasing demands of these organizations and their regimentation. Now, in the Soviet Union, the regime had the advantage of trying to mold an only recently urbanized and literate population. So there had been little alternative to the culture, that is, the exhibits, the plays, the newspapers, that the regime was offering. So these people who had recently obtained literacy did not have anything to compare what the Soviets offered them, to what the Soviets offered them. So in the case of youth, too, so spectacular was their upward social mobility under the Stalin regime that they were far less likely to react against the regime's propaganda. Don't forget that the British were the innovators both in the use of propaganda, and I'm thinking in the period around World War I, and in the development of youth organizations. And that the realism in art, we should also add, in the 1930s, and state interference in the work of artists was not confined to the totalitarian states. France in particular was obsessed with its own avant-garde and associated with degeneracy. But I left it up to you to identify what the real differences were in the techniques of propaganda. So, for example, art as propaganda, art under state control versus the democratic states. And in contrast to Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, youth organizations in Britain were not under state control, not compulsory, and did not directly, or shall we say explicitly, serve the interests of the state. So there's plenty of play, plenty of opportunity here for comparison and contrast. And it's up to you to work out whether you would choose to emphasize similarities in or differences when you're comparing democratic and totalitarian states. I mean, as a rule of thumb here, my principle is there are no right answers or wrong answers, just answers that are better or less well justified in terms of the evidence. Okay. Characteristic number 5 is the monopoly of weapons. Now, we didn't look at this one at all, and it is in many ways the most criticized of the characteristics. In a sense, what regime doesn't have a monopoly of weapons, or at least a monopoly on their legal use? In a sense, this is sort of a peculiarly American category, where many people have private arsenals that they may use to march on Washington if things don't go the way they want. But even there, I mean, when you think about sort of the American military police forces compared to these sort of private arsenals, it's kind of an absurd category. But never mind. This category is also sort of often passed over, and I think we should probably do the same. Which takes us to category 6, which is a centrally directed economy. And here we get the repetition of many of the major themes of the totalitarian model. So Friedrich and Brzezinski argue that planning was ideologically driven, that it demonstrated a high degree of centralization and state control. Control that was reinforced with the recourse to terror. However, here, more than in the other categories, Friedrich and Brzezinski recognized the difficulties that central authorities faced in realizing overambitious plans by means of coercion, making the plans paradoxically chaotic. Subsequent research has only reinforced this image. So certainly, there are many parallels between Soviet and Nazi economic planning. In the extensive systems of bureaucratic coordination, in the emphasis on investment in heavy industry, in the military, the generation of investment by means of the suppression of living standards. But there were substantial differences between the Nazi and Soviet examples, both in the structure of the planned system and in the goals of the planning system. So Soviet enterprises were completely state-owned and controlled, whereas there continued to be significant private ownership in German industry. And the aims of planning were also different. Nazi planning was directed at mobilization for war, where the Soviet aim of planning was the construction of the material base for a communist society. Not that there wasn't a significant military build-up, that is, for the defense of the revolution. We can, of course, think about planning in its European context. You will remember that particularly we need to think about the extent to which Soviet and Nazi planning found its origins in planning for World War I, and that after, or at least during the Great Depression of the 1930s, particularly as the Nazi and Soviet economies were very successful in a context of general European collapse, there was a general attraction to the idea of planning. But now let me hit you with final conclusions. Do you notice the general direction then of the criticism of the totalitarian model? Well, Friedrich and Brzezinski observe the regime's aspiration to total control, but they also exaggerate the successes of these two regimes. In general, Friedrich and Brzezinski exaggerate the degree and coherence of central control, and they exaggerate the importance of terror to that control. And that is why I asked you to remember the political context in which Friedrich and Brzezinski wrote, that is, the Cold War. At this time of superpower tension, Friedrich and Brzezinski were perhaps too categorical in their contrast of, on the one hand, rule by the will of the people in democracies, with rule against the will of the people in the totalitarian states. And yet, this should not discredit the broader project of comparing these two regimes. There are fundamental comparisons to be made. Perhaps most importantly, both these regimes explicitly rejected the liberal democratic order. Both Nazism and Soviet socialism were responses to the crisis of liberal democracy in the early 20th century. They were responses to the sense of decline of Western civilization, the sense of cultural decline, the sense of social and economic instability. And both sought to overcome this degeneration and disorder by imposing a new order from above, an order in which the interests of the individual would be secondary to the interests of society as a whole. But here the fundamental differences begin. The new orders idealized by the Nazis and the Soviets were radically different. The Soviet dictatorship sought to build a technologically advanced, fully urbanized communist order out of a backward agrarian country of small property owners. And Stalin was willing to destroy any individual or group that stood in the way of those plans. Hitler sought to create a greater Germany, and to revenge the humiliations of the Weimar Peace, and to put an end to the social tensions and perceived social, cultural, and racial decay that weakened Germany. Both the Nazi and Soviet revolutions generated remarkable social support, but both regimes, unlimited by law or liberal notions of the rights of the individual, arrested and executed millions of their own citizens in the process of achieving their aims. And finally, what of the European context? When I argued that many of the characteristics of these regimes were neither unique nor unprecedented, my object was not to demonstrate that these regimes were in any sense normal. Quite the contrary. But I wanted to show two things. One, that the Nazi and Soviet regimes were responses, the most extreme responses to a common European problem, the search for ways to arrest the apparent decline of European civilization. And secondly, I wanted to show that the techniques of totalitarian domination were not always the inventions of the totalitarian states themselves. Propaganda and state control of the mass media, economic planning, the mobilization of youth, censorship, the attack on the artistic avant-garde, the application of negative eugenics, these were not exclusive to the totalitarian states. Only at the beginning of the 20th century had it become technologically possible to attempt to mobilize the whole of society to a single ideological program. And this, tragically, coincided with a period of extraordinary disaffection with the idea of individual rights and liberties. So I hope that's told you something about Nazism, Stalinism, and the rise of the total state. Thanks.